Welcome to Windows on the World. This week we're going to follow up from an interview we did some time ago, which you can find at windowsontheworld.net. And it's called, What is Demonic Possession? Now, we're going to talk to Jerry Marzinski again tonight, and Jerry's a psychiatric practitioner, and his case studies indicate that schizophrenia may be rather different from the but he comes to different conclusions down the psychiatric profession, let's put it that way. And we've done a very long interview with Jerry previously, which you can find at windowsontheworld.net, and we're going to talk to him again tonight. And we're going to try and expand on the information that we put out in that first interview. So Jerry's not only a mental health practitioner specializing in psychiatric care, but he's a licensed pilot and a scuba diver, and he's an avid explorer of nature and things that go bump in the night, which is probably why he started looking into the bigger picture of what this is about. That's the world of schizophrenia. So Jerry, are you there?
I'm here. And if I were nuts working around all the psychiatrists I have all these years, they haven't caught me yet.
Well, this is it. And what we've learned from this so far is quite expansive, and if people want to go back to that first interview, and please do, we're going to expand on some of what we did in that first show tonight. And I find this area particularly fascinating. It's an area that I've looked in for years, and the areas that surround psychology, parapsychology, and indeed the conclusions you've come to about psychiatry and psychiatric practice really tie into that, and people are going to find out how that actually works. And tonight we're going to talk about schizophrenia. Now, we're going to talk about the several different types of schizophrenia, but mainly what's called paranoid schizophrenia. And the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia are extreme fear, hearing voices or commands, hallucinations, and the hallucinations and voices tell victims to do bad things, and often the victims of this see things that other people don't. We've gone into quite some depth on this before, and we're going deeper tonight, and we're going to give some case studies. Now, psychiatrists maintain that people suffering from paranoid schizophrenia have broken from reality and are psychotic or insane. And 4 in 10 psychiatrists, hang on a minute, 4 in 10, we'll get to that in a minute, 4 in 10 people suffering from paranoid schizophrenia will attempt suicide, and suicide is one of the leading causes of death, and the suicide rate is 5 to 10 times that of the general population. Now, also, what's interesting is several mass shootings have been done by people with paranoid schizophrenia. So, Jerry, I'm going to ask you first of all to explain how you got into this subject.
Well, I graduated from grad school and got a job at Central State Hospital, which at that time was the biggest psychiatric state hospital in the not only the country but the world. I think there were about 10,000 patients when I got there, and every mental disorder under the sun was in there. But I was assigned to a psychiatric rehabilitation center where we tried to get these people stabilized and train them at jobs so they could go out in society and be productive citizens. And one of the things that I hit when I saw this is that the ones who were diagnosed schizophrenic kept sabotaging themselves. They would approach success, they would approach graduation with a certificate or a license in cosmetology or car repair or barbering, and they would sabotage themselves. And it's like, why are they doing this? The second thing I found, they kept going off their medications, and that was the only thing keeping them in our world, with what we call sane. And it was almost like they wanted to return back to a psychotic state, which is hell on earth. I mean, it's just it's awful. And when you ask them why they did that, and when you ask the staff why they were doing this, staff would say, well, they're either crazy, they're lunatics, that's why they do these crazy things, or they don't like the side effects. And when you ask the patient, they will say, well, yeah, I don't like the side effects. Well, compared to going psychotic, the side effects are small potatoes. Why are you choosing the bubonic plague over the flu? Psychosis is so much worse. And they'd say, once you point that out to them and you compare the symptoms, they say, I don't know. They don't know. They actually didn't know. So I actually wrote this stuff out, and one sheet was like, what side effects have you experienced from your meds? And then I gave them like 3 sheets of psychotic symptoms and asked them to check off which ones they had when they were off their meds. And then I would give them both sheets back, and I'd say, which is worse? 100% of the time, well, going psychotic is worse. Well, then why do you keep going off your medicines? I don't know. That went on for years. It was driving me crazy. It's the side effects. You show them that the side effects are small potatoes compared to where they're headed, but they'll go off their medications over and over and over and over and over. You just can't keep them on those medications. So it's totally irrational. Why are they doing this? Nobody on staff is questioning that. It's like,
well, that's the interesting thing, Jerry, that the profession doesn't question it, and these experiences are referred to as hallucinations. But if you listen to our previous show and what we're going to be talking about tonight, well, maybe people will be able to come up with their own conclusions, and that's what we're encouraging them to do. But we're going to look also at the history of this and where it stands with over thousands of years, and how over the past, say, 100 years, with the advent of psychiatry, it's been taken into a completely different belief system. And as you say, these people are just medicated. So we're going to go into some of the details of what these hallucinations actually are, because we were talking about that just before the show, and I don't think we got onto that last time. But this idea of these auditory hallucinations, they're called, that people experience, or voices. Now, this is very interesting what you were saying about them being localized and non-localized. That was something that I picked up before the show, which I thought was extremely important. Could you just go into that?
You mean hearing them inside their heads rather than outside?
Yes, and then you were saying that there are examples where they hear the voices outside, externally.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
yeah. What happens when these voices enter? And we have a transcript of a guy who actually went through it that we might be able to get to. But all of a sudden, the person starts hearing voices that sound like their own thoughts, but the intent is different, and they're constantly negative, awful, demeaning, derogatory, and it's a lot of confusion. It's like, what's happening here? What's happening to me? Now, then there ensues a struggle between the original personality and the voices, which are trying to get more and more control over the person. So there's always a lot of confusion and struggle at that point as to what they think the voices are, how much they're going to give in to them, what they should do. Everybody thinking they're crazy, they're knowing something's wrong, but they don't know what it is, afraid to talk to other people about it. But as the voices get stronger, so as they continue to cave into them, these things get stronger. They generate more negative emotional energy, which is what they seem to feed off of, and they will move from inside the person's head to outside. Once they're inside the person's head, they can fade out, and they can kind of blend themselves in with all the hundreds and thousands of other thoughts that you have during a day, and they sound just like your other thoughts, but their content is way different. It's always consistently, unswervingly negative, and it's a fixed pattern. It does not vary. So psychiatry says, hey, these are hallucinations. They're not like any other hallucination in existence, which are random. They're all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're neutral. They just don't make any sense. There's no pattern to them. They're just all over the place. There's a very fixed, definite, unswerving pattern with what the voices are telling schizophrenic patients. And we're talking about paranoid schizophrenia here. All this information that I'm bringing up today is relevant only to paranoid schizophrenia, which is the largest category of schizophrenics. But there's other kinds of schizophrenia, hebephrenia, catatonia. I mean, a whole bunch that this information doesn't apply to. So as these voices get stronger, it's almost like they're emboldened. They will move out of the person's thoughts and just maintain a forefront. So they don't have to disguise themselves as the person's thoughts anymore. I mean, now they're taking on another kind of identity as the voices, and some patients name them. Other patients are confused as to whether they're who these voices are actually them, or are they something different, or what's going on at all.
When and how does that delineation happen, though, Jerry? For instance, if they're just a voice, then it becomes a name, it becomes a real entity. Is there any way this actually manifests? Does it manifest over time, or does sometimes people have a voice that they instantly recognize as a name? Have you ever come across that?
No, not instantly recognized. It's usually after a while that they either name these things or they ask them who they are. And if they ask them who they are, they'll say, "We're you." So they won't give a name. I mean, you got to work real hard to get a name out of them. But the patient will usually give the voices a name, and it maybe not always a formal name, well, that's the strongest one, or that one is the creep, or something like that. Sometimes they'll give them formal, well, that's Jack, or but I've never heard of the voices actually coming out and giving them a name.
That's interesting, because traditionally in the ancient world and the world of kind of spirits and entities, the naming of something would mean that you have power over that entity, because the name contains the entity. The name is the entity. So it's very interesting that they would give misleading names, or the person would just have to make up a name. That was the point I was trying to make, in that if these things actually, whatever they are, these voices, if they named themselves to be the thing that they actually were, then that would limit their power in the etheric world. It sounds a bit abstract, but we're going to get to that a bit later on.
I remember asking one of them what their names was, and they said, just like in the Bible, they said legions. And I was like, whoa, that's like, this thing read the Bible, or where did it get that?
Well, that's really interesting, because this is what Jesus said to somebody who Jesus had been told was possessed. And the man said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And it is thought that that referred to the Roman legions of 6,000 men. So that's really interesting. And of course, there are hierarchies of entities, and we may get to that a bit later on. But carry on, Jerry. That's a really interesting point there.
Okay, where I was moving was toward the prevalence of this disorder.
Yeah.
The National Institute of Mental Health here in the U.S. says there's about 2.5 million people a year in the U.S. who are being diagnosed as schizophrenic. The World Health Organization says there's 24 million worldwide. So it's also listed as among the world's top 10 health problems.
Now, the thing is as well, Jerry, before we move on, I'd just like to get this point out to people, is can you give us what is categorized and classed as schizophrenia generally?
Oh, you mean the
general kind of agreed kind of meaning of it?
Well, there's that's interesting. Okay, I can pull it off my head, but I have a listing here. Let me do it from mind. Okay, so if you're going by the clinical, what the psychiatrists say, okay, these guys are, they'll come in, they'll be having these voices, and they don't know what to do about them, so that they're either forced into a psychiatrist or they're desperate and they go into the psychiatrist. They tell the psychiatrist, "Hey, I'm hearing voices. You know, what's going on here?" And the psychiatrist will say, "Well, you're schizophrenic. You know, we have a treatment for this. We can put you on some medications that'll weaken the voices, and it's possible you might be able to live a somewhat normal life if you stay on them." Right. And if the patient asks, well, what does it mean to be schizophrenic? Well, okay, you drop down out of their professional terminology thing, and that means you're crazy, you're insane, you've broke from reality, you can't be trusted, you're psychotic, you're a lunatic. We can't trust anything you say. You're 3 sheets to the wind. You're not one of us anymore. You know, we don't know what's wrong with you, and it kind of scares us a little bit, but we got some medication that we can put you on that, kind of keep you out of trouble with everybody and kind of calm you down some. But you got to take it for the rest of your life. There is no cure for this thing.
Well, that's psychiatry, isn't it? Yeah, it's basically
rock psychiatry and
putting people onto drugs. But that's interesting that you say that. So somebody who goes to a psychiatrist or psychiatric practitioner basically says, "I'm hearing voices," and they get put into that very broad category of schizophrenia straight away. Is that what you're saying?
Well, pretty much. I mean, they say they hear voices, and usually the voices are telling them things that are make them paranoid. So along with that comes your voices are not real. They're hallucinations, and they're hallucinations because you're crazy. Nobody else is hearing them. You're out of touch with reality, the psychiatrist's reality, and the general reality that we all generally agree to, and you do stupid, irrational things, and we're not going to listen to anything you have to say about your voices because they're unreal hallucinations. And if we listen to them, we'd only be making you worse. So who do these people have to talk to? I mean, they've already scared away all their friends. All of a sudden you say one of your friends is hearing, voices telling them to kill themselves and tell them rotten. I mean, it's like, whoa, you kind of move away from them. So and it becomes a hassle for these people to deal with other people, because while they're interacting with the person, they got these voices in their head screaming at them too, and sometimes they get confused about who they're talking to. So, they'll answer the voice to the person they're talking to, and the person they're talking to looks at them like, what's wrong with you? So it's much less a hassle for them to just isolate themselves and stay away from everybody, and then they don't have to figure out what's going on. And also the voices are telling them, this guy's out to get you. You can't trust anything he says, or he's a dupe, or what a creep, or they work to isolate the person. And then the schizophrenic person withdraws so they don't have to deal with society or anybody else. But that just leaves them wide open for continued attack by the voices. So
what happens is they become more and more isolated, and all interactions become negative. In other words, interactions with other people become negative. So in other words, it's a bit like the old-fashioned superstition around what we now term mental illness. So nothing's changed. In other words, the new form of superstition is psychiatric diagnosis, and the diagnosis then creates the fear.
Well, they're kind of automatically thrown into that category of, hey, this is a lunatic. They call it schizophrenia, but I sense that the psychiatrists are a little bit afraid of these people.
Yes, but that brings us to the next point, which is that psychotics do crazy, unexpected, irrational, dangerous, and self-destructive things constantly, and nobody on the staff of these institutions that you worked at could explain why. Now, maybe we should go into some of these case studies. You have done this before, but I think you've got something to add to that tonight, haven't you?
Yeah, it's like nobody was asking, why they do these things. And I've talked to scores of staff trying to, why do you think they're doing this? And the big one was like, well, they're crazy. That's what they do. That's what crazy people do. It's like they can explain anything by saying, yeah, they're lunatics. They're crazy. That's what crazy people do. And then when it got into they're not taking the antipsychotic drugs and continuing to, revert back to a psychotic state, almost seeming to want to do that by quitting their drugs, then they say, well, it's the side effects, and we kind of touched on that. But when I first got into the hospital, there wasn't anything in school that prepared me for what I was about to see. And just some of the ones that kind of come up as I was first going to work there is we were sitting in the cafeteria, and the talk of the cafeteria for that entire week had been a psychotic guy who had cut off his penis with a razor blade, and they sewed it back on, and it was the talk of the cafeteria as to whether it was going to take or not. So everybody wanted to know if it was going to take. So it kind of tells you a little bit about, the culture in there. And then I had a friend of mine worked on one of the other units, and I was eating lunch with him one day, and I said, well, you know what, I'd like you to ask this guy why he cut off his penis. And he said, okay, I'll go do that. So we met a couple of days later, and I was thinking, well, what did he say? He said he didn't need it. I went, oh. It's like, all right, well, that's, that was like, that was a kind of like an inkling to how these people think. And there's not they don't try to figure out how these people think. They don't try to. They just say, they throw them in the trash and say, you're broken, you're irrational, you're crazy, or, but they have so much to teach us. They have so much to teach us about how the mind works. And traditional education and psychiatry and psychology are blowing that off. They're looking a gift horse in the mouth and just throwing it in the trash can. Another one I saw was a psychotic who slit his wrists in one of the rooms, and he kept his mouth completely shut while his blood was squirting out. It hit the ceiling. I walked in there after they pulled him out. The blood squirted so high it was all over the ceiling, and he did not make a noise while he was bleeding out. And I'm like, wow, man.
What happened to him? Did he die?
He died. Yep, they pulled him out of there. He was dead as a doornail. Blood was leaking out under the door. The other patients found in the morning. They opened the door, and he was dead as a doornail. Suicide was a big thing out there. I mean, a lot of patients attempted suicide, and a lot of them succeeded. But, then there was an airline pilot they brought into the building for the criminally insane who had murdered his wife because he believed that she was turning their son into a homosexual, and he killed her. And he was flying jets. And I'm like, wow. And then you got the gross ones, like some of these regressed psychotics would actually paint their entire walls in their room with feces. They'd cover themselves with feces. And some of the regressed ones would do stuff like biting off one of their other patients' ears. It was like there was nothing in school that prepared me for any of this.
Well, it's really incredible that there's this level of negativity around it. It's completely negative, and it ties in with the research I've done over the years and that we've already talked about. But the other important issue before we move on any further is that psychiatrists also get beaten up a lot by the patients, the psychiatrists who are dealing with paranoid schizophrenics get beaten up more than anybody else in the medical profession. Is that right?
Oh, pretty much. And
Yeah.
you know, it's like that's one of the first thing I noticed when I went to work at the state hospital, is in the cafeteria, which was the Grapevine Nerve Center. All the information from all over the hospital, and it was a massive hospital. It spread over 2,000 acres, so 200 buildings. But that was like the nerve center of what was going on around the hospital. And, you know, there would be these reports of, hey, the psychiatrist got beat up, and a few weeks later, another one got beat up, and a few weeks later, another one got beat up. And I noted him, wow, these guys are getting beat up at a tremendous rate. And I remember one in our unit, I think I spoke of it last time, a little scrawny black guy who was training for a fight. And I watched him as he trained for the fight for weeks. And I kept asking him, he's psychotic. I asked him, well, who you going to fight with? And he goes, can't tell you. Yeah. And then one day the psychiatrist walked up the stairs. He's crossing the day room, and this guy goes shooting out one of the halls, heading straight for him like a torpedo, and just flattened him. He just laid him flat. You know, one good punch right to the face knocked him out. Next day I came making rounds, and that patient was sitting in the corner drooling. The psychiatrist has got him back. He couldn't even move. So that was just one that I witnessed. But the actual statistics, you know, I looked these up because I'm going, well, is my perception correct or not? You know, a study done over 120,000 assaults from 1987 to 1992 over 5 years found that the assault rate for all jobs was 12.6 per 1,000. The assault rate for doctors other than psychiatrists was 16.2 per 1,000. The assault rate upon psychiatrists was 68.2 per 1,000. The assault rate upon custodial staff working around psychiatric patients was 69 per 1,000. So here you have a custodial staff who are around these patients 24 hours a day, and their assault rate is 69 per 1,000. Psychiatrists at the state hospital would only see these guys, for 20 minutes a month. And they were getting pounded at the same rate as attendant staff who were around them all the time. So you kind of think about that, and the assault rate is 5.4 times that of workers in all other jobs. You go, well, what are psychiatrists doing to piss these guys off so fast? If they're only seeing them 15, 20 minutes a month, and they're getting beat up by these guys at a rate higher than anybody else on the hospital grounds, what's going on there? They're all different psychiatrists with different personalities, but they're all getting beat up. So it's like they didn't look real dignified after getting beat up either. So I didn't know what was going on, but I found that very suspicious. Now, many years later, while I was working with the criminally insane in the state prison, I found that there was the voices who were telling psychotic patients to attack psychiatrists, who they believed were poisoning them with the medications they were prescribing for them because the side effects are awful. So I asked one schizophrenic guy, I said, how do your voices respond when you have to go to the psychiatrist? Now, these are his exact words. He said, the voices get mad around psychiatrists. They didn't want to go to the psych appointments. They didn't want me to talk to the psychiatrist. I got very mad at the psychiatrist during appointments, and I didn't know why. So that was very interesting. And later, other patients told me their voices told them to attack the psychiatrist. So that proved to be interesting. And then more interesting still is some other statistics here. The suicide rate of both schizophrenics and psychiatrists, both of them are 5 times higher than the general population. So the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1973 reported that the suicide rate in the general population in the U.S. was 11 per 1,000. The suicide rate of psychiatrists was 65 to 1,000, or 5.9% more than the general population. The estimated suicide rate for schizophrenics is 5.8 times higher than the general population. So what's going on here? Why do psychiatrists and schizophrenics have near the same 5 times greater suicide rate than all the rest of us?
Well, what do you think's going on here?
Well, it's interesting, ain't it?
Very interesting, Jerry. And we did get into a much broader kind of discussion before, but we're trying to focus it in a bit more today and get more information packed in. I would recommend that people listen to that other interview, which you can find at winnersontheworld.net and YouTube while it's still there. And yes, I've been looking at this as an outsider for many years. I've known quite a few schizophrenics. I have my own theories on what it is and what causes it, and we've talked about that. But let's carry on with this idea that the industry, the psychiatric industry, calls this a chemical imbalance. Now, can you actually define what that means? Because I've looked everywhere in psychiatric handbooks and nobody has been able to actually define what that means.
Because it doesn't exist, that's why. They don't even know what the right chemical imbalance of the brain is, let alone attributing it to one. They have absolutely no evidence for a chemical imbalance, and they've been trying to find for years. And there are studies that recently came out that straight out come out and say there is no chemical imbalance. That's a bunch of hooey that the drug companies and psychiatry are using to make a fortune off of these people by saying, these drugs kind of correct the chemical imbalance. What they do is they sedate the person and turn him into a semi-zombie. He no longer has, he's not the same person under these powerful drugs than he was when he was off them. They're making billions of dollars a year off of this chemical imbalance theory that doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's never really been defined. That's what I was getting to, and you've just explained that perfectly. And of course, psychology and psychiatry are inextricably linked. And there was a great book that came out in 1978 called The Psychological Society by Martin L. Gross, and it has some of the best quotes which refer to what's going on here that I've ever heard. And this is a great book to get hold of. He states that the citizens of the Psychological Society are the most anxious, emotionally insecure and analysed population in the history of mankind. Now, what I'm getting to here is the fact that we live in a completely neurotic society to start with. So when people are dealing with these really serious issues of things like paranoid schizophrenia, they just want to get away from any possible facts that are brought up. And you've given some great case studies and you've brought stuff to the table that we've talked about. And it carries on here. It says the major agent of change has been modern psychology. It's an art, science, therapy, religion, moral code, lifestyle, philosophy, and cult. It sits at the very centre of contemporary society as an international colossus whose professional minions number in the hundreds of thousands. The contemporary psychological society is the most vulnerable culture in history. Its citizen is a new mould of Westerner, dependent on others for guidance as to what is real or false. Sociology and anthropology are the human sciences coming from behavioural science. It carries on. Now, this jargon of psychology, it's become the currency of an entire civilization, and psych speak would arrive before Orwellian news speak. So the thing is that a lot of this stuff is coming from this new paradigm which is controlling society, and there's a lot more in ancient traditional viewpoints of this, in my opinion, and also for the cures of it. And even if we go into modern times, when you would get places like Broadmoor, which is a very famous mental hospital in this country, psychiatric institution for the dangerously criminally insane, And I've been in that place. I actually performed to the patients, and seeing people that desperate and drugged up, basically like zombies, the living dead, walking around in this hellhole of negativity, was quite disturbing. And it took me quite a long time to get over it. When I got out, I went there with somebody else, went in as a band to play to these people, and we were just shell-shocked after it. And the actual draining effect of it was quite profound. So to be around these people who are in this terrible state must be an awful drain on you. So how did you manage to keep sane?
Well, I had to get out of there. Weekends were critical, and take off and go camping and swimming and get out. My saving grace was being a rehabilitation center and training these people for jobs to get out. We were working with the highest level of them, and I had a lot of friends who were working with the lowest level of them. And some of the stuff, I don't know how they did it. I remember one story a gal was telling me where one patient bit off the ear of another patient while they were all asleep, and they couldn't put it back on again. The nurse had it in a glass jar in her desk, and the patients wanted to go bury it out in the front yard and give services for it. So now, I started off on some of those regressed units when I started working there, but I was looking for the highest functioning of all of them. But I got a very good dose of some of the lower functioning also. Now,
yeah,
one thing
definitely.
I found
yeah, sorry, Karen.
Okay, you were talking about the energy drain you felt.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, when I started probing, and this was in the state prison, I didn't know why this was happening, but if I worked with more than 2 schizophrenics in a day, I came home drained. I came home absolutely drained. I couldn't do anything, but they were so interesting, I couldn't stop working with them. So I had to make a rule never to work with more than 2, and preferably 1 a day, because of that drain. And I didn't know why that was happening, but I knew it was happening. So the rule I made for myself is never to work with more than 2 in a day.
Sorry, Jerry. This goes into another area of basically about energy and what is it, and harvesting of energy. And it seems to me that these voices and these entities just harvest energy. They're harvesting human energy. And we have talked about this before, but it's a very important point. Another point I'd like to make just before we move on is that in Broadmoor, during the Victorian times, because it is a Victorian hospital, in fact, this place that's full of very dangerously mentally ill people is actually an NHS hospital now. But it's a high security hospital, and indeed, when you go in there, they take everything off you, including your maps and your mobile phones. Interestingly, they let us take a load of tools in, which probably if someone would have grabbed one of them, screwdrivers and hammers weren't a problem, because we had some with us. We had a toolbox with us, but they didn't look in there. They looked under the car with mirrors, and they took our maps away. They took the maps away from us in case anybody stole the maps and found out where they were. Well, I think they know where they are. I don't think any of them are that far gone, but the point is that the Victorians used to encourage mentally ill people to paint and be creative, which actually fired the neurons in a very positive way, because it made it, from the mind being shattered and divided and isolation, there would be unity through being able to paint and observe nature, which I think is a really important point with all this, because a lot of this stuff, this negativity, when people are taken away from any natural surroundings, they get much worse. And if you look at a place like Broadmoor, it's basically a maximum security prison with these prison officers breathing down their necks, and they're just basically in there rotting away. So in actual fact, mental health care has got a lot worse.
I fully agree with that. That this at the state hospital back where I was there, they had music therapy and some other things. I mean, they had a full-time music therapist or 2 of them, and they had the rehabilitation center I worked for. So they were actually trying to do something for these patients. But as time wore on, that stuff started dropping out, and then Proposition 13 swung through from California, basically saying our taxes are too high. What we'll do is we'll put out a bunch of local mental health centers and close down all the state hospitals. And when I heard that, I went, these guys aren't taking their medications in the state hospital. What makes you think they're going to go to a mental health center and go through all the trouble to get there, and pain and taxi cab fare, or get some? They don't want to do it anyway. So they're not going to go to these mental health centers. So they released, tens of thousands of psychotic patients onto the streets, going, oh, we're going to treat them in a more natural environment now. They're going to be out in the community. They're ending up on the street corners begging for pennies to get drugs now. Most of them turn into drug addicts. The other ones commit crimes to survive, and now the prisons in the U.S. have turned into the state hospitals. So what they have is these psychotic patients in there that they're not giving any psychotic drugs to unless they're causing problems. They end up in gangs, and they end up in these violent confrontations, and their voices get stronger, and they get more callous and violent, and then they serve their term, and they release these guys out into the public, out the front door with 2 weeks worth of medications, and say, hey, when you run out, go to the nearest emergency room. And just toss them.
It's crazy. It's
insane.
This idea also of drugs opening up these gateways is very important. So the drug abuse, especially like you were saying, cocaine, methamphetamine, is extremely dangerous, because it makes these voices and so-called hallucinations much worse. In other words, whatever these entities are, they feed off the drugs, and they feed off the fear, and they feed off the trauma. Can you go into that?
Well, it's odd that the voices have their preference as to drugs, which drugs they want their victim to use, and the number one is amphetamine, which will drive people psychotic quicker than any drug I've ever seen. There's so many people in the state prison who started using amphetamine, started hearing voices. They thought they were hallucinations. They went away after a day or two. So they're going, oh, yeah, there are hallucinations. They went away, and that goes on for a few months. And then one day they don't go away, and they're psychotic for the rest of their lives. Due to the amphetamine, it's like it opens up the door. The alcohol, the withdrawal from alcohol is nasty. You drink enough alcohol and you're going to delirium tremens, and so what the voices want is drugs that feel good at first, and then during the withdrawal phase, they wreak havoc. They generate a lot of emotional anxiety and negative emotion, which is what these things want to do. They want to generate that negative emotional energy, and then after they strike, after they hit the person's drained.
Yes, so in other words, they enjoy the high and the come down. So they're harvesting energy, and they're harvesting the pleasure, but they're also harvesting the trauma. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what they're after is the negative emotional energy, and if they have to instill trauma to get that, then they do that. They will do whatever they can to generate that negative emotional energy, tell lies. Now, one thing, if they can get the person in trouble, like get him thrown in prison, which is a totally negative environment, then they don't have to spend a lot of energy trying to get him to do something screwed up to get him in trouble, because that environment is so tumultuous and so negative that it's going to generate the negative emotional energy without them having to invest in it. They just come and feed like a hog's trough, and they really don't have to do anything except maybe, hey, that guy over there is going to attack you. You might want to think about hitting him first. And the gangsters use these guys for torpedoes, as we talked about. They would get a paranoid schizophrenic, make him more paranoid, tell him that gangster on the other gang is going to kill him, so he better get him first. They gave him a shank and say, go get him, and he stabs that guy, and the gang goes, yeah, you want more of that, where that came from? We know how to do it. So,
well, this is basically like black magic, isn't it? This is what black magicians are doing, but these people are doing it with these physical zombies that are being used to attack people. And yes, it's a very important point you just made, though, that often mentally ill people are used to attack other people. It's happened to me. I mean, these people who are suffering from delusions are often used by people as proxies, which is absolutely despicable. But it's all part of this kind of misuse of energy and this interruption in the unified field of things, really, because all this seems to start with negative energy or negative vibration being put into situations and then into people. And I think the bigger picture of it is extraordinarily interesting. And we're trying to keep it on track here and keep very practical, because we went into some of these ideas before, and over the next couple of weeks we're going to expand on it. We've done quite a lot on parapsychology and also this idea of entities attaching themselves to people, not just in a negative way, but just in not in the way of paranoid schizophrenia, but in the respect of parapsychologists studying this kind of thing. And it takes us into a much bigger area, which the Catholic Church in particular has been very instrumental in writing down the whole history of this and what their interpretation of it is. But of course it existed way before then. And I've been looking at some of the history of possession and entities, and as you're saying at the beginning of the show, Jerry, this just goes back thousands of years. It goes back as far as I can see, as long as we have been walking on the planet in whatever present form or form that we are today. In that respect, it's been here for thousands and thousands of years, and it's what is referred to as archons. It's referred to as demonic entities, even though demons are actually not necessarily what people think. Demons, the original word was Greek, D-A-E-M-O-N, came from the Greek, and that could mean angel or something bad. It didn't have to be anything that was necessarily negative, and this is all very interesting. But what we're focusing on tonight is these particular entities, which seem to be kind of they're low-level energies, in my opinion, but they're very, very destructive. So in other words, if there is a hierarchy of these entities or whatever they are, and we're going to get into that more in part 2, then these things are kind of bottom feeders in a way, aren't they? They're the sort of lowest end of it, but they themselves are beholden to their own slave masters. And this is something that you've also looked at, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I ran into a couple of cases where I don't talk to these things much because I don't feel comfortable with it. But I was asking one, like, aren't you bored with doing the same thing to this patient all the time? It's just you just and they say, yeah, we're bored with it, but we were told that if we didn't destroy this guy, that we would cease to exist. So they're told they have no light in them. They're if they don't do what they're told, they will either go to the pit, which I don't know exactly what that is, but I've heard of it several times, and they will be punished there. They're also punished if they're discovered or if they speak to one of us other than their victim. So they don't want this kind of information coming out at all. This is, and the fact that they are parasites, predatory parasites that are feeding off the negative emotional energy that they generate in these people is the last thing they want anybody to know. And it's that energy, the generation of that energy, which is why they are so negatively oriented. They never say anything good to the patient. It's always horrible, negative, derogatory, disgusting things, and then they have access to their entire memories. So they can go back and bring up rotten stuff the patient has done and long forgotten about, and rub it in their face and say, see, this is what a rotten person you are. You don't deserve to exist. Everybody hates you. You look at all these awful things. It just goes on and on and on, and it's endless and it's ceaseless. And these guys are getting more and more desperate and it generates that negative emotional energy. Now, if they can get them to attack somebody, or to seriously hurt themselves, or to do some other screwed up thing that's going to get them in a lot of trouble, that generates even more emotional negativity. And what they're after is that negative emotional energy. They can't stand positive emotional energy. So, the people who are positive, preachers, that kind of, they don't want them anywhere around. But they want to generate as much negative emotional energy as they possibly can. And you kind of carry that one step further and look what's going on in the world right now and what's coming over your television set. You turn on that TV, it's 98% of what's coming out of you is negative. And in the U.S. here's kids watching people shoot each other for decades. It's almost like normalized on TV, and then they go out and they get a gun, they shoot somebody, and it's like, oh my God, the gun did it. Well, you get rid of all these guns, and then they turn to knives like you guys are struggling with right now. It's nuts.
Yeah, these things seem to be hive-minded. In other words, this negativity, especially with this knife crime, it is actually perpetuated by it being put on TV, in my opinion, because
exactly.
It starts to become part of this hive mind, and some of the people who are doing this are on drugs, and they're part of a hive consciousness. But interestingly, you were saying that when schizophrenic patients, paranoid schizophrenic patients, threaten to kill themselves, then the psychiatrists start taking the voices seriously. Now, this is very contradictory, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's very interesting. That's something that blew me away when I was working at the state hospital. It like, if a patient tells a psychiatrist that the voices are telling him to kill himself, and there's a huge suicide rate with these patients, they will believe that. And they will take that patient and they will drug him until he's a zombie. They'll lock him on a suicide watch because the voices are telling him to kill himself. So they act like they're poked in the butt with a hot stick, and they jump and lock this guy up and fill him full of drugs, and we got to stop him from killing himself on my watch. But yet the voices are telling these people hundreds and thousands of things other than that. But those are hallucinations. But that one isn't. That one is backed by fact, of the high suicide rate. But all this other stuff is garbage. That you can't. That's hallucinations, and it's meaningless and useless. And these guys are crazy, and these are delusions, and so they don't even try to find out what these things are, or how they operate, or how these people think.
Which is astonishing, Jerry. It's absolutely astonishing, because you were the only person I've ever heard talking about this on a show several years ago. And it completely blew me away, because you were incredulous about this in a way that I've never heard before. You were approaching it from a situation of, well, I'm a professional, and this is just out of this world stuff. This is absolutely incredible. But nobody really has put these case studies down. We've covered people like D. Scott Roggo and all these people who are in the parapsychology in the 60s and 70s, and that seems to have been quite marginalized now. The actual Parapsychological Association is still on YouTube, and these guys like Charles Tart are still speaking on there, but you don't hear anything about them. And they were breaking down the barriers with all of this stuff, not just in the area of where we are talking about, with people getting possessed by entities or whatever people want to think these voices are. But also, we discussed The Infinite Boundary, a book by D. Scott Roggo, where people had actually become possessed or been taken over, and not always in this entirely negative way. There's one story of an artist who was actually quite well known, Swain Gifford, who got taken over by somebody else. Swain Gifford's work was actually completed by a person who used to walk past him every day after Swain Gifford's death, and it's a big story. And it's not just conjecture, because it was really looked into at the time, and it was actually looked into over several years. very, very, very thoroughly. And we've got stories in there of people having out-of-body experiences. The Private Richie story, when he was in hospital, in the army hospital, and he had the out-of-body experience, and he saw ghosts leaping into people who were really, really drunk, who'd opened themselves up. They'd opened up some kind of gateway. And this is the sort of area that I've been looking at for years, and why I find it so fascinating. But this is probably a good time to take a break, and I think it's been a very interesting first half. So over to you, Tony.
Cheers, Mark. We've got some Psyambience coming up. Great show, gentlemen. Well done. We'll be back in 6 minutes and 30 seconds.
Welcome back to Windows on the World. I'm here talking to Jerry Marzinski with Tony Hurst, and we've had a very fascinating first hour. We actually did another show with Jerry, which you can find at windowsontheworld.net, and it's called Are Demons Real? And we go into the wider picture of what we're talking about tonight. Tonight we're focusing back in on this religion of psychiatry and its closed-minded way of dealing with things. In other words, that you just get put on drugs for life. And I've seen this happen to people, and I know what the results of that are. And these drugs that people get put on are absolutely terrible. They ruin the nervous system, they ruin the brain, and they eventually just kill the host. They turn the host into a zombie. So the thing we were talking about before the break was how the psychiatric profession deals with all this and what Jerry's found out over the years. We're going to talk now about how you can get into trouble very quickly with psychiatry if the powers that be learn that you are asking patients what their voices are telling them. The psychiatric profession accuses you of making matters worse. So would you like to pick that up, Jerry?
Yeah, I've had a few bad experiences with psychiatrists who caught me or patients complained. And at the state hospital, like I said, the unwritten rule is you don't upset psychotics. You just don't do it. It's not a smart thing to do. But in order to learn about their voices, they would get irritated when they were questioned about their voices, if you could get them to even talk about them. And some of them went and complained, oh, he was asking me questions about the voices and I don't like it. And I'm sure the voices were saying, yeah, go tell the. And I ended up in front of the psychiatrist on the carpet with them ordering me to quit asking patients about their voices because they were hallucinations, and they were certain they were hallucinations. There was not a doubt in their mind because that's what they were taught in medical school, and you don't question what's taught in medical school. And like, you can stop it. You're upsetting my patients. I want you to stop. They're getting worse. You're making them worse. And I'm like, what? They're not any worse than they ever were, and there's no permanent damage here. They might get a little bit upset, I'm thinking, but you have to bow down to these guys because they're the top dogs in the mental health field, and kind of bite your lip and kind of go, yeah, okay, and then wait till it kind of blows over and then go back again. But yeah, if they found out that I was asking questions about the voices to these patients, they would not permit it. You're not allowed to go there, and that was the excuse they gave. And they would, I watched what they would tell some of these patients. Just ignore the voices. So I called one patient in one time after the psychiatrist told him that a couple of weeks later. I said, how did that work? When you ignored your voices, what happened? He said they got louder. They would not be ignored. And that was consistent throughout. You talk to any psychotic patient, any schizophrenic patient, and you clinicians out here, listen to these symptoms. Don't trust me like I didn't trust them. You listen to these things and ask your patients if their voices get louder if they ignore them. Ask your patients if the voices are consistently negative. Ask your patients if there is a marked drop in their energy and their physical and emotional energy after the voices attack them, and see for yourself. Don't trust me. Look and see for yourself. And those of you who are parents of schizophrenics, look and see for yourself. This is all leading somewhere. It is verifiable, and it doesn't exist in the books. And as long as psychiatry and the drug profession and big pharma control the institutions, it's not going to get into the books.
It's not, Jerry, because like you were saying that drug representatives are constantly in and out of hospitals, and we see this even with doctors. Most doctors are getting lobbied by drug firms, and they become lobbyists for drug firms, and the privatization of medicine, obviously in America, and which is pretty much the same model here, which the public haven't really been told about but has been rolled out, does tend to facilitate this. So in other words, billions of dollars a year they get selling drugs that suppress the symptoms and they do not cure anything, and they slowly destroy the brain and the nervous system of the patient, and in actual fact they will never ever cure the symptoms. Am I right here, or is that a little bit of no exaggeration?
Well, no, I think you're pretty right now. In some cases I've seen where if they caught it quick enough, just as the voices were starting, that if they were given the drugs then, that would knock them out before they took root. But what we have here is that I wanted to expose the audience to is what it's like for an actual patient to begin into a psychotic process. It's very confusing, and how it starts. So there are different ways the process starts, and like I said earlier, abusing amphetamines brings on a very quick onset of psychosis if it is kept up and heavy levels. The prisoners called amphetamine the devil's drug. It is a very dangerous drug. So there was one patient I talked to, and the voices come at various rates. Sometimes they start off slow. Sometimes they just start off and they're there. There was one case where I was talking to a patient who was telling me that her voices acted more like somebody getting into a new car. They would tell her, "Hey, go pick up that pencil over there," or go sit in that chair. Or, it was almost like it was trying to determine how much control it had over its new vehicle here. And once these things start in, there's a lot of confusion. The patient's kind of going, "What's going on? Are these my thoughts? Are these thoughts from somewhere else?" It's very confusing and very fearful because the patient doesn't understand what's going on. And he has to kind of make a determination if the voices are his thoughts or they belong to some unknown entity, or is he going crazy? He knows they're not normal.
That goes back to the beginning of the show, and I was talking about that. I think it's a really important point to hammer home that the voices can be apparently inside the person or externally. And you were saying before the show about that case where that chap heard them in the background and they were outside the house. Now that was fascinating to me. Can you just relay that again? Because that's really important.
Yeah, this is an actual case history I wrote right after while I was with this guy, and it took place on 7/16/2003 at about 11 o'clock. And he came in for his appointment, and I'm always probing. I was always looking, kind of what the devil is going on here. I mean, what is going on with these people? And I was questioning him, and I said, when did you start hearing the voices? And he said, this is word for word. So what you have is one of these guys kind of talking to you, telling you how this came on and what it's like for this to come on when they start hearing voices. He said, the first time was in my house. I got a big house away from everybody in the high country. I wasn't drinking. It was dusk and cloudy. I was sitting alone reading. I began hearing voices like somebody was talking in the distance. It was a very stressful time in my life. And these things are often brought on by stress. And then they get stronger with stress. And he said that previous weekend I was drinking, probably a 12-pack of beer, but I wasn't drinking anything the day this happened. My nearest neighbor was 300 yards away. I was sitting there reading when I heard voices from outside my house, like on the dirt road in front of the house. People walked their dogs up and down and around that dirt road all the time. So hearing voices from the front of the house wasn't all that unusual. I had a fountain and a fireplace going at the time in my house, and the wind was blowing outside, as it always did up there. After 15 minutes of hearing the voices, which should have moved on if it was somebody walking their dog, I went to check what people were doing outside my house with all the talking. It was unusual. I finally decided to get up and look out the window. There wasn't anybody out there. I got curious. I could still hear the voices, but I couldn't make out anything they were saying. I went outside and looked around the house. There wasn't anyone there. At first, I thought it may have been a combination of the fire and the water fountain, and I went outside. But now that I was outside of the house, I couldn't hear the fountain or the fire, only the wind blowing through the trees. But even so, I could still hear the voices. But when I concentrated, I could tell the difference between the wind in the trees and the voices. I looked all around the house, but found nothing. I determined that it must have been the wind carrying the sound of the voices from my neighbor's yard. His yard was a few hundred yards off. So you know how sometimes the wind carries the sound of voices in lone places. It was mostly flat out there, and I knew how far voices could sometimes travel if the wind was blowing the sound. What struck me as strange was that I could still faintly hear them inside and outside the house. I went and checked the back shed to see if anyone was hiding there. I peeped my head in cautiously, but no one was there. I heard the voices for about 15 minutes this first time before I decided that it must be the wind blowing from the neighbor's yard in the distance. It was the only reasonable explanation I could come up with. This is the very first time I noticed things were getting a little weird. And I asked him, the voices this time, however, appeared to be coming from outside your head, right? Not like compulsive thoughts you mentioned earlier. He said, yes, they were coming from outside my head. They were definitely not my thoughts. So I asked him, so did things go on this way for a while, or was there a break about 2 weeks where there was nothing like that happening? He said, I continued to drink, though, and to cope with my problems by drinking. So, that's alcohol is one of the things that the voices want them to drink. He said, then one night I got up early in the morning to go to the bathroom, and I could hear the voices again coming from a distance. I went outside with a flashlight and looked around. There was nothing there, and there was no one on the road. Again, it sounded like the wind might be carrying the voices from one of my neighbor's houses, but it didn't make a lot of sense that they would be up talking 2 or 3 in the morning. I heard the voices at night a few times when I got up to go to the bathroom late at night. Once I got the flashlight and went and checked all around the backyard and the shed. There was nothing there. And then later on, he goes on to say, I started hearing them through my TV, and the control, it was the TV was exerting control on me. It may have something to do with my wife leaving me, so apparently his wife left him. I looked at the registration for my truck one day, holding it up to the light, and I could see lightly in the background a stencil that said void. I came to the conclusion that I didn't really own the truck. The government only wanted to give me that impression. But the void written lightly in the background really meant that the truck wasn't really mine. They could come and take it any time. So at that point, he kind of snaps, and he looks at me and he goes, "What are you going to do with all this information you're gathering?" He said, "It's more evidence that I'm crazy, that I have to be put away. Why do you want to know all this? I'm not crazy. Are you collecting this evidence to use against me? Are you building a case on me?" I've heard this before, so I just roared with laughter, and I said, that would fit into your worldview, wouldn't it? Now, why would I go through all the trouble when all I'd have to do is write up some bullcrap about you and have you transferred to the mentally ill holding cells over to medical unit? I could make up some lie and have them haul you away. I could give them this stuff and have you haul them away. You'd go off like a firecracker, explode in their faces, scream and holler, and throw fits all over the place. And that would be a reaction to show you're nuts. And then I could use your crazy, violent reaction to make a case that you were really nuts. Now, who do you think they're going to believe, me or you? And why the devil would I go through all the trouble of asking you these questions about what you experienced if I were going to send you off to the medical unit and the psych unit? I said, if I was going to do that, I could have already done it weeks ago. So,
yeah. What did he say to that?
He kind of calmed down. I said, why? You're doing good. You're not causing any trouble. I told him you're coming to group. You're trying to straighten yourself out. You're doing well. And that kind of calmed them down considerably. And that's one of the things that you have to work at real hard if you're going to dig in this area, because these people don't trust psych staff, and for a very good reason. A lot of bad things have happened to them by talking to virtually anybody, especially psych staff, and especially in a prison, where everybody's paranoid anyway.
Yes. Well, another point that I think is quite important here is that when this starts, the patients have a problem making a determination if the voices are thoughts or they sound like thoughts belonging to some unknown entity, or if their voices are indeed some entity, or whether they're actually the patient themselves. So you're saying that there's some confusion to start with. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of fear. And what I've found is that what they decide for themselves these voices are has a dramatic effect on their potential to recover. So what I found is that about 1/3 of them will come out and straight away say they're demons. That's what I think they are. They're demons.
Really? And that's quite common, is it? Because this was the kind of general direction of the show that we did last time, and we're trying to clarify some of these cases and give people an insight so that they can make up their own minds. But that's a very interesting point. So the patients themselves believe that these are entities that have invaded them, or either or do they believe that these are some kind of sort of spirit or entity, or do they believe it's something that's actually taken them over? What was your thoughts on that?
Well, there were three parts. There were the ones who believed that these were demons. Another third didn't know what they were, and the worst off of the bunch, the ones who were always the worst off of the bunch, were the ones who believed what psychiatry was telling them, that their brains were broken, that they were psychotic, they were crazy, there's no hope for them, that they had to take these poisonous drugs for the rest of their lives, and that they were mentally ill, and that all that could be done for them is these drugs. That they were the worst of the bunch. But the ones who decided that these things were demons or something other than themselves, now they're not blaming themselves for being totally out of control and not being able to behave right or get in trouble. They see that these things want to get them into trouble and will get them into trouble if they listen to them, but they are not who they are. They are something different, although they sound like their own thoughts. They sound just like the thoughts, thousands, tens of thousands of thoughts that come through your head every day. They sound just like those, except their intent is very different, and it's very negative, and it's very destructive, derogatory, negative, self-defeating. It's consistently a negative thought stream.
Yes, another point that you brought up was that when asked who the voices were, the most consistent response you found was that the patient would hear that the voices were saying, "We are you."
That's
we,
if the
plural. Yeah.
Yes, that's if the patient asked them who they were. They would respond, "We are you." So the voices want the person to think that they're their own thoughts, because once they realize that these aren't their thoughts, then that really weakens them, and they have, like, the patient isn't going to want to be taken over by them. So there's a fight going on, but at least the patient knows what he's fighting.
Yes,
he
the intention
knows he has an enemy.
Yeah, the intention of the voices then is to deceive the patient, basically.
Oh, yeah. They do not want to be discovered. They, like I said, they will come and go outside of the normal patient's thought stream. One thing you can count on, if something bad happens, the voices will show up and make the most of it. Oh, you stupid person, you shouldn't have done that, or they will be there. They feed off of that stuff. So the more negative emotional energy they can generate, the more they feed, the stronger they get. Now,
yes, they take over the host. They're basically taking over the host, and they want more control over the behavior. This is something you were saying earlier on as well.
Yeah, exactly. They want more and more control. So, like I said, if they could get the guy into prison, it's a negative environment, and it generates. I mean, there's tons of negative emotional energy all over the place there.
And it said also that they may start by convincing the patient that they're friends. Friends, and that they both have supernatural powers. Is that what you were saying?
I've heard several cases like that. There was one where they were telling this girl that they knew the answer to the tests, that she was in college and she was making good grades, and these voices were giving her answers to the tests, and they were right. So they convinced her that they were her friends, and she began to trust them. And then as soon as she did, they started turning on her slowly until they were telling her to kill herself, that she was useless and worthless. She had to drop out of college. She couldn't hold a job. She was making straight A's. And the voices had pretty much, destroyed her.
So what does the entity get out of destroying the host? What do you think it is?
Well, that's always puzzled me. It's kind of I've had a couple of cases where the patient was about to commit suicide and the voices actually stopped them. But what's strange is, like, okay, if they kill their host, it's like a tapeworm, killing its host. What happens then? My best guess is they just move on to somebody else and destroy them.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, this idea of the entities trying to transfer is something that I've looked into before, and I have had these things attack me. Maybe it's a slightly different angle than we're talking about here, but I think these things are all linked. I think it is part of a same dimensional area of research. It's a massive area, so we need to be focused. But you were going to read out something, a description of a personal experience of what it's like to begin to go psychotic. That would be very good to hear at this point of the show, I think.
Well, that's what I was reading, but I didn't finish it. So, and I have some more articles like that. Yeah. So this guy goes on to say, he said, everything was starting to get confusing. I drank to calm myself down. But of course, then now upon withdrawal, he's got the shakes, which feed the voices. He said, I heard rumors that the house I was living in at the time was built over an Indian graveyard. So this is the guy who was hearing the voices out in his front yard and stuff. He said, I thought it might have accounted for the strange noises at night and the scratching on the windows. I wanted to check this out with the owner, so I made up a story that I wanted to buy the house in order to find the owner. So I went through the realtor I was renting from to find out who owned the house. And when I reached him, I asked if he might be interested in selling the place rather than continuing to rent. And then I asked him if any Indian artifacts had been found on the property, and he said that they had been. And he said, I thought this might explain the strange scratching on the windows. He said, come Christmas, I drove to the city and stayed in a hotel room by myself to get away from everything, the scratching, the government control, the paranoia, everything. It was on the way back from Phoenix that they got me. He said, the cops stopped me. The voices got him to attack the cops. And and he beat up a cop. So he said, I thought I would be in prison only for 2 months. He said, I've been here now for 2 years.
Was that the first time you went psychotic, though?
Yes.
Yes. So that was the actual point of him becoming
that's where he's
psychotic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where he snapped, and the voices took control of his behavior. Basically, told him, these cops are badgering you for no reason. Get them.
Yes. Yeah. Now, this is an interesting point as well that you're making, that those who accept the voices as friends, eventually they will be destroyed. And this is something that you've observed happening. Can you go into that?
Well, yeah, they will regret it.
Yeah.
And that's one of their tactics is they come on and Ouija boards is another place where a ton of people get infected. There were a lot of people in the prison who started off with Ouija boards. I mean, they're dangerous. They're not toys. There was one where, the voices try to convince them that, we're your friends. We can help you. So this guy, the voices would tell him which houses to rob and where the police were, and he said as long as he listened to the voices, he was fine. And I said, okay, smart butt, how'd you end up in prison then? And he said, well, there was one time I didn't listen to the voices, and I went and robbed the place that they told me not to, and I got caught.
Yeah. Well, you gave a great example of that before as well in the last show about the chap who was told where the marijuana field was by the voices, and he went up and he filled his bags, and then he was told not to go up there again, and he didn't.
Yeah, that was the guy. I have some direct transcripts from him here too. I mean, it's actually him talking. But basically, what the voices tell these people are that well, we were talking about strange things that they do. There was one where I walked into the ER to start my shift, and one of the patients who was psychotic and came in, she was laying in one of the beds, and the voices told her when I walked in, said, "You stay away from him. He's dangerous." That was odd. And I did get to work with her. She told me the voices told her that. And one of the most dastardly things these things do is they get people in trouble, and then they laugh at them. And one of the more hideous ones I heard is where they promised a patient, after badgering him for decades, that if he would gouge one of his eyes out, that they would leave him alone. They would go away. So he did that. And he disfigured himself, destroyed the eyeball. And I said, well, what happened? What did they do? He said they laughed at him and they mocked him, said, how could you be so stupid as to believe us? Now look what you've done to yourself. You are such a stupid idiot. And now you look like a monster. I mean, they imagine how much negative energy that generates. So some of the direct thing, now these came right out of the mouths of people who were hearing the voices, and what the voices told them. You have no reason to feel good. You'll never get what you want. You're stupid. You're ugly. You can't succeed at anything. Nobody likes you. They're faking like they like you. People are talking behind your back. The government's watching you. Go ahead and use drugs. They'll make you feel better. It's okay to rob others. You're worthless. You're a burden on anybody. You should just go ahead and kill yourself. There is no God. Jesus couldn't help himself. He's not going to. How can he help you? Don't try anything new or you'll fail. Others are out to get you. This is just a sample of the actual things that these voices tell people that psychiatry doesn't want to hear, because these are hallucinations. Now, these are well-formed sentences. The voices talk to these people in well-formed, thought-out sentences with a negative intent, a negative, destructive intent. It's clear. This isn't word salad that they're hearing here. Now, all other hallucinations are random. They're totally friggin' random. They're all over the place. They're good, they're bad, they're negative. Does this sound like, I mean, you can see the pattern in just this one page.
It sounds like the tormentors are actually tormented themselves. And this is what we talked about before. In other words, they were miserable creatures who were under some kind of control themselves, and their only way, or their only knowledge of any way to carry on, was in this hellish world where they would be preying on other people. Is that a good summation?
I think so, because they don't seem to be very happy characters. Yeah, I've never heard one laugh. I've never heard one crack a joke. It was always this heavy, negative vibration that was just draining. Now this is very different from any other kind of clinical hallucination.
Yes.
You can see that there's a well-defined pattern here, and this pattern is predictable. I went from one side of the U.S. to the other, 2,000 miles away. The voices that patients were hearing in the state hospital 2,000 miles from here are the same voices that they were hearing in the prison, in the psych hospitals, and the ERs 2,000 miles away here in Tucson. It's like they're all made from the same cookie cutter.
Yes, they're all coming from the same dimension in a way, or that it's consistently negative, like you're saying, and you've explained that really well. Now, I wanted to bring something else in that we talked about, which was the devil worshipper, the Satanist, who said he was actually given energy by these entities.
Oh yeah, that guy was spooky. I didn't spend a lot of time with him. He was as spooky as any of them. He wasn't. He just caught my attention. And if I saw a psychotic guy who I thought there was something I could learn from, I'd call him in the office and kind of grill him, which was kind of nice, because I had the authority within the prison to do that. You couldn't do that in the state hospital. But I pulled him in, and I knew he was a devil worshiper, so I started asking him about that. And I said, one thing I don't understand was, all the other patients I work with who hear voices are drained; they have no energy. But I've been watching you. I've been watching you for weeks. You look like you have plenty of energy. That I know you're hearing voices. I read your case record. Where do you get the energy? Where does it come from? How come you have energy and none of these other guys don't? And I knew he was a devil worshiper. And one of the first things I asked him aside from that was like, well, what does a devil look like? And I was expecting this hideous, ugly. No, he said absolutely beautiful. He's absolutely beautiful. And he was given these details, and I'm like, wow. That's not what I was expecting. I'm thinking to myself, but he said, yeah, he's gorgeous. He's absolutely gorgeous.
Well, that's really interesting, Jerry, because in the old tradition of looking at this stuff through the eyes of the church, this is how Satan has been described by people, that he can appear as this fantastic creature or light, and it's all down to the way that the interpretation is going on and how the entity manifests itself. But the Satan, or the devil, is the main controller of a lot of these lower demons. So maybe that's why this fellow was getting some energy, and these lower demons are so subservient. They're basically parasites, and they have to drain energy.
Yeah, I think this guy was, kind of a couple of steps up from the regular ones. And what he told me about the energy thing, he said, they give it to me. I said, well, who gives it to you? Well, those above me give it to me. And I asked, for what? And he goes, well, to get certain jobs done. And I didn't want to ask him any more about that.
Yeah.
So I kind of stared about that. So here he's getting this energy from another source other than himself, and it's not coming from any of the any victim, because he's not like the other psychotic guys. He's not like them.
Well, according to Manly P. Hall, these two archdemons are Satan and Moloch. They're at the top of the tree.
Well, I don't know where he stood, but he wasn't like them. But he told me he could astrally travel to a bigger prison, almost 100 miles away, and he knew everything that was going on with certain prisoners there and happening in certain cells. And that was like, wow. But the guy gave me such a creepy feeling. I never called him back because I really didn't want to hear about some of the stuff he was involved with. Like, it's like, just the regular stuff's bad enough.
Yeah, well, the regular stuff seems to be that after the voices have attacked and they leave, they fade away for a while, the patient's energy levels will consistently drop to the point where they can't function at all. So they're just sat there absolutely drained. Now, this is the norm from what you're saying. Is that right?
Yes. That's another thing, you clinicians out there, don't take my word for it. You go see it for yourself. Ask them after the voices attack them and leave. And the voices usually attack 3, 4 in the morning for some reason. Ask them what their energy level was before the attack and after the attack. And there's a marked difference. They have a lot more energy before than after. There's one time I did, when I knew how to do this stuff, I ran some statistical stuff on it, and it came out as statistically significant. And you can see that for yourself. And what I did was gave them a scale, like on 1 to 10. How much energy did you have before the voices came? How much energy did they have after? And I kept those two graphs together. And it was very consistent and very observable. So those of you working in the field, watch for that. And also watch for the totally negative pattern of what these voices are telling these patients. They are not your regular hallucinations. They are not random at all.
No, and I think people who are in this field should actually look at the history of this and really go into it and basically open their minds up, because once you start looking at it in the bigger picture and start looking at it as though we are able to communicate, or other dimensions can communicate with us if we open ourselves up. And basically all of the world of parapsychology is about this. It's about how we process information. That's all it's about. It's about how we process this information that's coming through this unified field and what impinges on it. And this is a scientific thing that can be looked at over eons. And it's not just out of a manual that was written in the sort of latter part of this century. And the handbook that these psychiatrists and generally the whole field of psychiatry uses is just something that comes out every year, and they keep adding more and more mental illnesses to it. Like, of course, we can have not just ADHD, but we've actually got disorders now for people who don't like doing what they're told by authorities who don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, they had Southern Belle syndrome here, which kind of put, half of the southern part of the country. They gave the females a diagnosis. Imagine some psychiatrist got beat up for that by the wife somewhere along the line, because they eventually took it out. Homosexuality used to be in there as a mental illness. So what they do is they dream up these labels for illnesses, and it started off with a couple hundred, and now it's up into the thousands, and then the subclasses of these things, and they're just all descriptions of what people have. And I remember when I was going through abnormal psychology and you were studying all these things, I'd come out of there going, well, I got that, and I got this, and I got that, and everything that came up, it was like, well, yeah, I got a touch of that in there too. So it's like, and then the drug companies come up from behind and go, oh, well, you got this illness. It's in the DSM. We have a drug to fix it. We have a drug that will address that. And it's just endless. And you look at the TV commercials, and it's like drug companies are selling, and they're dumbing down the entire population of the earth. I just saw an article.
Yes, a friend of mine had a disorder, and it was really to do with anger. And she went to see a psychiatrist, and the note just came back with the drug that had been administered, and she was told she'd never get better. That wasn't in this country. Someone put something in about people in other countries and psychiatrists in other countries being rather different and treating it as a spiritual malaise rather than a chemical imbalance. I'm not sure whether that's actually true in the world of psychiatry, but can you give us some of the examples, Jerry, of what these negative entities tell the victim? Because you sent some to me, and either I can read them out or you read them out, because that's quite an interesting list you've got there.
Well, yeah, go ahead and read them out. Now, I have some other short cases here of what they were telling them also.
Okay, great. Well, some of the things that are on the list here include: you have no reason to feel good, you will never get what you want, you are stupid and ugly, you can't succeed at anything, nobody likes you, they're faking it, people are talking about you behind your back, the government is watching you, go ahead and use drugs, they'll make you feel better. It's okay to rob others. You're worthless and a burden on everyone around you. You should just go ahead and kill yourself. There is no God. Don't try anything new, for you will fail. Others are out to get you. Hundreds of others, all consistently, unswervingly negative, derogatory and destructive. That's to add to that list there. So that's quite comprehensive there, Jerry. Interesting that they say that there is no God. So in other words, you are a slave to this kind of entity forever, and there is no hope, no way out of it, and there is no solution. That's what they try to tell you. But we're getting near to the end of the show, and you did find some solutions to this, didn't you? Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, what I started experimenting with when I was there was, since the voices are constantly telling these people negative things and to do negative things, what I surrounded myself with in the prison was a group of prisoners who were rare, who would tell me everything their voices were telling them. And I worked with them intensely, and I protected them also. And what I found is that, or what I started trying is, okay, we're going to do the opposite of what the voices are telling you. So if they're telling you, this negative thing, you need to do the opposite. And I'd check on them and make sure they were doing that. And after a while, they started improving. The voices got more and more negative, or less and less and weaker. And then I started getting reports from those patients, and not just one, that the voices were really getting fed up with me. They're really getting angry at me for interfering with what they were telling these guys to do. And I'm like, I didn't want to believe these things were entities or demons. I didn't. My denial system was tattered. I mean, it was beaten up, it was falling apart, but I still hadn't given up on it. And I was thinking that somehow this must be some facet of the patient's subconscious mind. I mean, demons, who believes in demons? I mean, and here they are coming in saying, hey, our hallucinations are getting fed up with you. They're really getting pissed off with you. And it's not just one, it's a bunch of them that, they don't see each other. It's a big yard. And I'm like, well, what's going on with hallucinations getting angry at me? Next thing I know, one of my TED top patients, who appeared to be doing very well, comes in, and he as he's leaving the session, he turns around and he looks at me and goes, "You know what you're doing is very dangerous, don't you?" And I'm like, well, I never thought about it. I mean, I thought these things live in your head. I'm not telling them this, but these things live in your head. They can't come out of your head. They can't come and get me. I mean, this is your deal. So I'm thinking that's the way it works. And that same guy, about 2 weeks later, he comes in and he knocks on my door without an appointment. He says, the voices have something they want to tell you. And I'm like, what? Yeah, they want to speak to you. So they want to talk to me directly. And he said, yeah. And that had never happened before in 15, 20. That had never, ever happened before. It was always the patient would tell me that the voices were calling me names and not to listen to me and get away with me. And that would come. The patient would interpret and pass that information to me, and then I'd pass information back to him. Tell your voices to go stick their heads where the sun don't shine and get lost, and it would go that way. The patient was always the intermediary. I had never had them come through and talk to me directly. up to that point. And I sat down and I was like weirded out. And I go, okay, what do they have to say? And I'm sitting there looking at the guy, and with a straight face, his voice slightly changed and got deeper. And these words came out of his mouth. They said, "You have no right to interfere with our way of life." And I'm like, our way of life, plural? That's not the patient talking. And then right away he goes, I didn't say that. That came from them. Those weren't my words. And I was just stunned. I was like, holy cow, they are separate entities. And they're they're warning me to back off. I'm like, whoa. So that freaked me out. I mean, my denial system with regard to these things being separate, being some part of the subconscious, I mean, completely just shattered. There was no doubt at that point that these things were independent, malicious, destructive, parasitic entities that were feeding on these patients, and I was later to find out feeding on us all to different degrees. So
yes, I was listening to something last night, and I've got books on this, many books actually, looking at this whole area, the historical area of it, entities, demons, or angels. In fact, as we said earlier, the delineation there is really down to the interpretation or the observer or the action. And this Catholic priest was saying that diabolical obsession or possession is a very real thing. It invades the body, the demon or entity resides in the body, and it becomes the demon's property. So the entity or the voices will regard that person as their property, which is very interesting and kind of backs up what you just said. But interestingly, the belief is that the soul will always remain free. So the soul can always be set free. And there was a purpose in the Catholic religion for priests to become possessed so they could fight the evil demon and get closer to God, which sounds very risky to me. But that's actually recorded in Catholic scripture.
Well, there's a Father Pio that was alive during World War II, where they talked about him constantly fighting demons at night, and furniture would be thrown all over the place, and he would have scratches on him, and he was. I think they made him a saint, but his autobiography is very interesting. And I did run into one patient where the voices told me, she's ours. Back off. She's ours. Well,
I've actually experienced that myself, and I was trying to get rid of an entity in somebody or telling it to leave, and I had a real battle with that, and I've told you about it. I'll go into it at some point, and we've talked about that, and we could maybe talk about that in the future, because that's fascinating, and it's a slightly different area than you're talking about, but it was very much related in the respect that I believe there was some kind of possession going on, not to the absolute detriment of the person at that particular point, but I believed it was going in that direction. And what happened to that person as a result of this entity really did back up what you said. It was completely negative, and the life was ruined. And the only way out of that is for someone to try and deliver them from it or help them. And you've also talked about that in the respect that these entities can be encouraged to walk into a better place. Could you just kind of end with that?
Well, yeah, there was a time where, I was experimenting with talking to them, but if that can be done, that would be the easiest way to do this. But it's not going to work in all cases. It worked with some of the weaker voices, where when I was speaking to them, they had told me they were assigned to this person. And they weren't, I knew they weren't supposed to be speaking to me and they weren't supposed to be discovered. And I also know that they were told by their higher-ups that they have no light in them, and that if they didn't do what their higher-ups were telling them, that they would cease to exist. So if they didn't torment this person and try to destroy them and do a good job at it, they would cease to exist. Or if they were discovered, like I did with one of these weaker ones, and if they spoke, they would be sent to some place called the pit, which I don't know exactly what it was, but whatever it was, they didn't like it very much. And
so these things maybe get let out. They get let out and they get assigned to someone. It's interesting you use the word assigned, because obviously the signature and the name and all that sort of stuff, we can't go into that tonight, but it's very, very important as far as this is concerned, because obviously these things do not want to be named. They want to be known as we just said there, and you made that point very strongly. But I think maybe we could go to any comments, if there are any comments that Tony could read out in this short period of time we've got left.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Just responding to a chat comment there. Let me get my comments over. We've had lots of comments. Cheers, everyone in the chat room, for that again tonight. You've been awesome in there. Well, as we were saying in the break, you're probably going to want to do another show anyway. I think we've got lots to get through, and some of these comments are probably going to bring us into some different directions, especially this first one here from Eric. Is it the first one? I think, no, it might be a bit further down, but anyway, we'll get on with it. A close relative of mine appears to have multiple personality disorder or some form of demonic possession. She married a very odd husband that created a strange atmosphere. I think we've all met one of those. He also says the close relative went on to emotionally destroy her parents, but she didn't understand what she was doing. Possessed people, for want of a better term, seem to radiate a form of negative energy about them that drains you emotionally. Yes, I can confirm that myself from my own experiences. Gremlin says, okay, oh no, we're going to leave that one, because you just mentioned that about that when you was talking before. Back to Eric. Yes. When visiting my close relative's sister and her strange husband, it would take about 3 days to get over it. It was emotionally draining. Yeah, agree again. Lunatics build castles in the air. Psychiatrists collect the rent. I like that one. I personally think the sanity of psychiatrists comes into question. And what about people that come out of a coma speaking in a different accent and sometimes a different language? Now, that's an excellent one to be getting into at some point.
I think that's really important, Tony, because that's one of the major things that exorcists try and do to see if a person is possessed. They try and get the entity to speak in a language that the person doesn't know, or to relay information that the person has never had access to. So that's a really interesting point, yeah.
Yes, speaking in tongues, I believe they call it.
Well, I experienced that in Canada. It's a slightly different thing, but I believe it is a form of possession. People are inviting entities into themselves when they do this sort of thing, as they are doing with seances, channeling, spirit guides and all the rest of it. We've talked about that and the New Age and the dangers of that. I'm not down on everything there. There's also a bigger picture to this, which goes into a massive area, as you were saying, Tony. So we certainly haven't got time to get into that this week, but we will do in the future.
Yeah, Stu wants to know, isn't psychology a Nazi gig? I've no idea myself, but one of you two gentlemen might know. Did they come up with it?
We've been into the history of psychology and where it came out of. I think you'd find that it really came out of Sigmund Freud and the early part of this century. The whole idea of it is conceptual, and we have gone into that. We've gone into the Psychological Society. Read the book by Martin L. Gross, The Psychological Society, one of the best books on psychology and the promotion of psychology ever written.
Yeah, okay, nice one. According to Gremlin, Freud was a Zionist, and Eric says so was Marx. But I'm not sure how relevant that is.
It's not relevant at all to what we're talking about, but no. Yes, these are true statements. However, we're talking about entities, or we're talking about people with mental illness here, commonly known as paranoid schizophrenia for this show. That's what we're concentrating on, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Eric says... Go on, sorry, Eric.
Yeah, the one where you were talking the difference between schizophrenia and the personality, split personality. Those are two different things. You know, the split personality will actually take on different personalities. You know, and there's strange things happen when that happens. Like if they take on one personality and they're allergic to another personality is really allergic to something, this other personality, if they eat it, they don't get the allergic reaction. So it gets very different. There's actually different personalities, and they're not necessarily negative or demonic. They're just different personalities. So
yes, I think we were talking about that before
strange.
the show, Jerry. Yeah. They're not just one. It's not just one entity. There can be multiple voices.
Well, that was the multiple personality. Now, schizophrenia, they call that multiple personality too, but that's different. That these things are consistently negative where the others aren't, and sometimes these guys, the schizophrenic ones, they will speak in a language that they don't know. The voice will speak in a language that the actual patient does not know. You know, but they're two different things.
I think we're drawing together something very important, and you have made that delineation, which is very good, because the thing is with this stuff, it goes into a lot of different areas, and multiple personalities totally different to what we're talking about tonight. I think we have to make that delineation there. Yeah.
I have a short case here thing. It's like a half a page. If you want me to read it, it's actually the person's words.
We've got 1 minute.
2 minutes left.
1 minute.
1 minute?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll just read the highlighted stuff. It says, he reported the voices told him that if he tells anyone about them, especially the psychiatrist, he will shoot him full of drugs and needles and send him to the crazy hospital. So here's the voices telling the patient not to tell the psychiatrist about him. Yeah. And I think that's, I don't know how many times I've run into that in questioning patients where the voices come through and they tell the patient, don't tell him anything more. He already knows way too much. I must have heard that 10 times in pulling information from psychotic patients. These things are conscious. They're aware of what's going on, and they're aware of who and what is a threat to them, and they will react to that.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Eric. Thank you, Larry. I've been reading too many comments from Eric. He's done well in the chat tonight. Put a lot in there. And so have a lot of others. I'm sorry I didn't get to read out many of them. I will pass them over to Mark and Larry, and they will examine them for the next show.
Yeah.
God blimey. Look at me. Go on, take it away, Mark. We're done now. We're finished, aren't we?
All right. Thanks a lot, Tony. Thanks a lot to Jerry Marzinski. We're going to do a lot more with Jerry in the future. And take a look at our previous interview, Are Demons Real?, which is on winnersontheworld.net and YouTube. And we're going to be following this up in the future. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, Jerry.
Yeah.
Cheers, Mark.
Have we?